So today we have a different episode. Our focus is not necessarily somebody's body of work and their background. Of course, it's also included in our conversation. But today we're here because we would like to call your attention to the Global Language Advocacy Day, which is happening on the 22nd of February next week. I guess it's next Wednesday. And to tell us all about it, we have Cari. I cannot pronounce her last name. So when she introduces herself, she will actually tell you what her name is because I cannot pronounce it. I'm not sure if it has some sort of a French twist or what it is, but here we have Cari. She's pretty well known amongst the translators community on LinkedIn. So I'm sure everybody will recognize her, and it will be amazing to talk to her. So I cannot wait to hear all about. Well, tell us at least a little bit about yourself and your name, please, Cari.
Hi, thank you, Rita. Yeah, it's Cari Bottois. You're
Right.
absolutely right. It's the surname's French. The first name is Welsh.
Oh.
Yeah, and I'm a co-founder, coordinator at Charity Translators. So we're a network, not an organization.
Mm-hmm.
I always like to explain Charity Translators as a network of people, and we support other charities and community groups with translation support, language support, and not just translation projects. Actually, we offer advice and guidance and information and knowledge sharing to charities that reach out to us, and we try and share that knowledge as widely as possible, specifically within the charity sector, mostly within the UK. But we do interact and engage with community groups and social purpose organisations across the world. But yes, we are mostly UK focused, since that's where most of our requests for support come from.
Mm-hmm. So I was pretty curious about your work because I'm mostly involved with the commercial life of language. And you are basically on more of a community, right? That's what you call it, community side of the language phenomenon. So I cannot wait to hear all about that. So you have to talk about it because as you announced it, it was unscripted, and so I'm actually not here to ask questions but to listen to what you have to say and learn from you.
Thank you. Well, this is a great opportunity for me, because as you said at the beginning there, next week is Global Language Advocacy Day, and hopefully we'll be able to share this talk, or this conversation that we're having on Global Language Advocacy Day.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a wonderful organization. Also, I would call it a network as well,
Mm-hmm.
called the Global Coalition of Language Rights.
Mm-hmm.
A lovely, wonderful group of people from all over the world who are coming together to advocate for language rights. And that's, I suppose, where I'm connected to it, because that's essentially what we're trying to do with Charity Translators, is to support languages, and try and meet those language barriers that happen all the time in all kinds of different contexts,
Mm-hmm.
although we focus very much on the charity sector. And today is a great opportunity really to talk about community languages.
Mm-hmm. So what are
And
those really? That's a as you know, it's a brand new concept to me. I told you before, and I was really surprised that it even existed as a concept. So if you could just start by talking about that a little bit.
absolutely, yes. Well, the concept of community languages is obviously one that can change, I suppose,
Mhm.
depending on where you are. But as a term, it's actually been around for a very long time, for
I'm missing
decades,
out.
actually. Um, Mostly, I would say, maybe in kind of academic
Hmm.
circles. This idea of community languages has been around for a long time. I'm specifically talking about the UK context,
Right.
and that's why I say I think, you know, ideas or definitions or what it might mean can vary quite significantly. So I'm only talking about the UK context because I wouldn't
And it
dare.
also depends on the communities that you have around your area, right? So all of
Absolutely.
that.
But in recent years, actually, this idea of community languages or this term, this phrase, has become a lot more mainstream. We saw it actually a lot during the COVID pandemic in the UK, this idea of community languages. And I would say actually it's mostly used in the more mainstream way by governments, government agencies, institutions, you know, so that's where maybe it's coming into the public consciousness a bit more, is through these kind of public facing organizations that are using this term community languages. And essentially what it means in the UK is languages that aren't English, to put it very
Right.
bluntly. And actually that's exactly what it means. And
Right.
that's the way they understand it when they use community languages. And I suppose essentially what it means is languages that are within the community, within our communities, that aren't the dominant language.
So
So
in your
speak.
case, in your experience, and because obviously you're very connected to, you know, the world of translation from a different perspective, but you are. So what languages are we talking about in your specific experience?
Well, that's actually quite interesting because the UK has always been a multilingual place. Um, so you know it's often seen as English. You know, English could be seen as the greatest or maybe biggest export of the UK. But
It's my favorite,
actually,
I have to say.
but the UK is multilingual. It's always been multilingual. You know, there's Welsh, there's Scots, there's Irish, and these are often maybe characterized now as minority languages or heritage languages. You know, but it's true that they're not, you know, they are maybe not as common, and that's absolutely, you know, it's not as common as English. That's for sure. But in terms of community languages, that tends to be understood, and like I say, by the government, by institutions, etc., as almost languages of migration. So here we're talking about every single language. It's huge. What's really interesting, there was a population census that took place in the UK in 2021, and that really looked at and asked for what languages were kind of happening in the UK, and which is fascinating data, for want of a better word. And we're talking over 100, you know, more than 100 languages that are represented. So we're talking about languages like Polish, Arabic, Romanian, Urdu, Farsi, Bengali, you know, all kind of languages of migration. And those are, yeah, so that's how I would say others or the institutions describe community languages.
So if you have people who speak French or Portuguese or one of those more, let's call it mainstream in Europe languages, you wouldn't consider them community languages, or would this be included if you had like a particular percentage of the population in a specific area?
I think that's an interesting question, actually, because yes, they are community languages. Yeah, I would definitely consider Europe, or you know, any language that isn't seen as the dominant language, i.e. English in the case of the UK, as a community language.
Yeah, because
Yes.
they were brought in by other communities that are now your community. I guess that's what's behind that, right?
Yeah, I think the interesting maybe distinction, and something I think we should probably not shy away from actually, is that there's maybe a perception or a belief or an understanding that those mainstream, let's say dominant European languages, French, Spanish, German. And I think we should come on to those maybe languages in a little while, are often seen as people with those languages are perceived as having maybe a better grasp of the English language or more proficiency in the English language. So they might not be always considered, as you maybe automatically assume that maybe they wouldn't be classed as community languages. I would class them as that. But I think maybe more widely those perceptions come in, and those languages wouldn't be considered as community languages.
Yeah, because it has to do with the idea that we have about the people, right, who speak those languages. So we immediately to think, oh no, I mean, of course, Portuguese people, there's a lot of Portuguese people in the UK, everybody knows that. And I wouldn't even think that it would be a problem on a first glance. But then if we look at it from another perspective, from a more social perspective, it depends on what people's lives are like once they immigrate, right? And I've been an immigrant myself, and obviously I was lucky enough that the two countries that I went to were the United States and Spain. So communication was never an issue. I didn't even take that into consideration given my specific situation. But I can only imagine how it is for someone who hasn't had the contact that I have had with those languages from those countries where I decided to go to and live there. But still, the whole shock of learning other things that you don't know because you know a language, obviously. So that could take us very far. But for example, talking about specific situations that you cannot run away from, such as dealing with the IRS or with a bank or with school for your kids. And all of this brings in a new dimension of language that we don't think about when you think about languages from my usual point of view, which is translation for websites, for internationalization, from all of that, right? So those things were actually shocking to me. And you don't even have to go that far because, for example, food was I would say my main problem. Food was my main problem.
And I actually think there's also a lot to be said for maybe regardless of your, as we're talking about the UK, your English language level of proficiency. I think there's still a lot to be said for how you receive and understand information in your own language compared to your second language. And I think that's a really, and that's why I would consider all languages that aren't the dominant language as being a community language, because, you know, like you say about education or in, you know, that how you understand information in your own language is different to how you know, there's less of a barrier there. And I think that was definitely shown during the COVID pandemic and the translating and the interpreting of that information. So I think there is a lot to be said for that. So those a really great example would be, for example, imagine if you wanted to go to therapy, you know, and you lived in the UK. Imagine having that therapy session in your second language as opposed to your first language. That's very different.
Yeah.
You know.
Exactly. No, and everything else that is for real life. That's my experience from real life. I had to learn basically everything because yes, I could even know the words, but the specific meaning in the context, it's a whole other story. And I can only imagine the shock of someone coming from a very different culture, for example, because the European example is not so good because obviously we're more open to the world. We've been places, most of us, but a lot of people who come from other places in the world where realities are very, very different.
Absolutely. And I think that is one element that I often see understand in terms of community languages, that it is very place-based. It's about the individual and how they interact with with the world around them. There are many social spaces, a bit like what you just said now about how, you know, your kind of language world is about localization, translation, kind of business. But in terms of the individual actually they're interacting with multiple spaces, you know, whether it is employment or education, whether it is healthcare or, you know, legal settings, whether it is more social, whether, you know,
Yeah,
whether
they're
it's
not
about
dealing with work. They're dealing with
it's
their
ever
real
well it,
life.
there's
Yeah.
yeah, there's so many different
Yeah.
elements to it, and how that kind of, I suppose, you know, family life, everything, you know, and how how that relates to them, can be very different, and how that relates to overcoming language barriers or how people respond to language barriers, can be is very different in all of those settings.
One of the
I
things
think
that,
that's
sorry.
a really kind of, you know, it's a really interesting point,
Yeah.
that actually there are so many areas where language barriers may need to be addressed or supported, where language rights should be supported. And to be honest, it's not always, you know, it's not always good enough, I would say, in my opinion. That's why Charity Translators exists, you know, that actually the the ability, to be able to respond to language barriers is not always the ideal. And how, you know, and it's true, you know, over the years I've had to accept the fact that, the ideal is almost, the exception to the rule, which is a shame in many situations. We see it in the UK a lot, actually, challenges to do with, especially in areas like healthcare, engaging with government institutions, but also on a more kind of, let's say, outside of those institutions, there's whole areas as well, you know, and that's why we work with that's why I work with the charity sector, because it's an area that is often one of the most difficult areas, I would say, for responding to language barriers.
Yes, and I'm wondering how you actually do it. 'Cause how do you go about finding or matching those translators and interpreters to the needs that you know exists in the community you're focused on? It's like amazing to me because I know how it goes in when you're looking for people to work in your project, right? And everything is commercially discussed, right? Rates and time periods, blah blah blah, all of that
Hmm.
stuff. So is it? I think, as you know, I've told you before that someone like you has great ideas and input for the rest of us who work more closely to the commercial side of languages, because since you don't have that in the equation, so what happens? How do you go about finding these people? How do they get matched to the specific needs in the community? How
It's a
does it
great,
happen?
really great question. It's such a great question. Um, First of all, I would say, you know, our initial response is always about knowledge sharing. So if a charity, when a charity contacts us, and actually it's not just charities that contact us, you know,
Hmm.
we have a wide variety of people who contact us that we can't really support because they are from the business sector or they're from an
Ah,
academic world, you know.
why would they
Um,
contact you?
that well, this is yes, this is the issue, I suppose, that we come down to, which is tends to be the cost question,
Right.
um, but also a lack of knowledge. I think
Mm.
when, people see, a network or a charity like Charity Translators, they feel they can approach us
Mhm.
and get information that is, maybe unbiased, you know, so I think there's an
Mhm.
element of that as well. But yeah, just to come quickly to, I suppose, how we do things, is obviously we're very lucky to have, lots of, let's say, knowledge on our team. Um, Obviously, I've worked in this area for over a decade, so
Mhm.
I've developed, you know, quite um, a huge amount of knowledge and being able to understand and interpret people's needs when they
Mhm.
contact us. You know, I very much take that approach of a knowledge sharing approach, you know, we never dictate to anybody what they should do or how they should do it. It's about giving them the information so that they can then make the choices or respond in a way that works for them. So that's definitely the initial point. Sadly, and it's really hard for us as a charity, but we don't support interpreting.
No, you don't. I thought you
No,
did.
no. We only work with text-based translation support. There are numerous reasons why that
I
is.
can understand.
Yes,
I can understand
as you can imagine.
that.
But
Yeah.
as we say to the charities that reach out to us, it's very difficult to find volunteers with the right languages, the level of experience needed for what you're doing, the availability at the time you need it, to be able to coordinate that. And there's other aspects as well, such as safeguarding, DBS, which is like, about making sure there's no criminal offences that the volunteer might have, lots of complications around
because of the
doing.
settings, right? Because it's health,
Yes,
it's prison, who knows, it's
not
court.
necessarily. I mean, that's the interesting thing about the charity sector, actually, is people will often automatically assume that it's, really almost
Hardcore.
critical. Yeah, really critical stuff.
Right.
But our volunteers did a project not recently, which was a community garden project.
Oh.
that just wanted to advertise what they did to people in their community who speak other languages. So there's this there's this huge array of charities. Some do very critical, intense work.
Gary, you need to,
Others don't.
you need to speak up about all of this, because I don't think the vast majority of us, even if we are as deeply involved in thinking, learning, working on languages, cannot even begin to fathom any of that information in any possible way.
It's such a diverse area. But so sadly, we don't support interpreting because it's not something we're geared up to do. But we do signpost. So if somebody does need interpreting, then we can at least explain the dynamics of interpreting, give them information, so that they understand what it's about. And then we can signpost maybe other agencies, other charities that maybe could help them, and possibly even, professional services if that's what's required, so we can at least support them in interpreting. But in terms of the translation work, we obviously screen the charities, screen the project, make sure it's suitable as a volunteer project. Then we reach out to the network. We're now, I think we're over 1,200 volunteers now in the network. We see if anybody can help. So we wait to hear back if we have enough volunteers to manage the project. Then we go ahead, and then we tell the charity that we can go ahead. So they're aware that we can only support them if we have the volunteers to do that. And then we do almost a two phase, sometimes 3-phase process, depending on the situation, where we have volunteers do the first draft, the translation, and we have other volunteers who tend to have more experience in translation, do the review and those kind of updates. And then we send it back to the charity with all the disclaimers that need to be done when you're working in a voluntary kind of area. So it's a lot more complicated than just yeah, it's a lot more complicated. We have to look at the project. Sometimes the project needs editing before it can go for translation. Or
you mean the original text?
Yes. Because they'll, many people will use acronyms, or the charity sector, like I said, is diverse. You have some organizations that are highly organized and almost like a business, and then you have small community groups who what they've written, they've done themselves. They're not copywriters.
So who tends to come to you? Bigger institutions or smaller institutions? You
all
cannot pinpoint.
All kinds, to be honest. There's it's always a surprise.
I bet.
Yeah.
This is why I say that I can only imagine the type of information you could convey in a professional setting, because I mean, you know about so many things that the rest of us usually don't think about, because
Well, and also what's been interesting, especially over, the whole 10 years, is actually coming to realize all these different nuances, these different pressures, these different areas that I suppose it's not something you necessarily see in the language industry
Mhm.
in terms of, and when I talk about the language industry or the profession, I'm very careful to kind of highlight that I tend to be talking about business,
Yes.
you know, which and there are lots of almost connections between business and or the translation profession and the charity sector or the social sector, that
Mhm.
maybe we should put it. That it does intersect, but that there are lots of things, I suppose, that maybe are more I don't know how to describe it, but I suppose things about the profession that are not always the same in the social setting.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I mean, the clear example, if we're talking about, and as we're talking about business,
Mhm.
businesses have an income, they have profits. If they're translating material, then it tends to be in order to make profit,
Mhm.
so there's somewhat of a budget there, even though, as we
Yes.
know, in the profession itself, those budgets tend to be always squeezed or not enough, or so there are
Right.
problems there too. But in terms of the charity sector, um, these are organizations for the most part that do not have any kind of budget or money or
Mhm.
for language support.
Right.
um, I think something like, I think it's some off the top of my head, I think it's only something like 12% of registered charities in England and Wales have a budget of more than £250,000
Mhm.
a year. I mean, if such a small amount of charities have more than that, you can imagine, it's like an iceberg effect, really, of all the charities that just don't have um, any kind of any kind of possibility of supporting the people they're trying to help with languages
Mhm.
and trying to, it's just impossible. And to be honest, even the charities that do have much bigger budgets, much bigger income, let's say, that all tends to be allocated.
Mhm.
I think, again, off the top of my head, I think 95% of the income of the whole charity sector is spent, which means there's only 5% of leeway for anything that may not be expected. And as we know, actually, in the profession, it's not easy to determine in advance what you might need.
Mhm.
It's those are difficult things.
Yeah.
Even the most well-financed, organized charity who knows that they're dealing with people with other languages, they will budget maybe for something to help those, but then something might happen. For example, an influx of refugees, and
Right.
and we've seen that in the UK due to the war in Ukraine,
Mhm.
that actually all of a sudden there's a huge demand for language services and language support, and that hadn't it hadn't been, you can't
Predict that.
guess,
Yeah.
you can't predict it in advance, and so there's all kinds of, let's say, complications.
Yes, it's true.
But I think it is quite interesting, and maybe looking at the um the language support for Ukrainian refugees is an
Mhm.
interest is an interesting case example in a way for talking about community languages, and how that can be a challenge for charities, but
Mhm.
actually also for public services, government agencies, healthcare systems, etc. Um, so if you can, as we were talking earlier about actually thinking about the person,
Mhm.
the individual, and how they're kind of interacting with different areas. That there's the family setting.
Mhm.
So in the UK, many host families came forward to host refugees from Ukraine. Absolutely, wonderful. But obviously there's a language barrier there in the family. So
Oh,
in a
yes.
sense, so we've seen a lot of examples of using technology, the famous Google Translate,
Right.
the
The infamous.
infamous, absolutely, the infamous Google Translate has been relied on a lot, but also other apps. So the speech apps where they speak in English, it comes out in Ukrainian, and that's been happening kind of in family settings and social settings. And I think we're going to touch a little bit now on the what I tend to call the professional problem.
The
Da,
professional
da,
problem.
da. The professional problem
Okay.
when it comes to community languages. So, as we know, the profession is kind of set up in the. I'm going to talk about the UK specifically because I know it's kind of different, everywhere.
And by profession, you mean translation-related
Translation,
professions?
interpreting. Yep. So what, who is a professional?
Right.
As we know, the language industry is regulated, but almost self-regulated in a sense. So in the UK, you tend to have a master's degree in languages, in translation, interpreting. There are other qualifications that you can have in order to kind of benchmark you as a professional. All kinds of, there are different options and different varieties.
Right.
But for example, in the case of Ukrainian refugees, what became very clear very quickly was that the lack of professional translators and interpreters with Ukrainian. It was, it became obvious very fast that actually the number of individuals who were translators and interpreters by profession and who met those standards in the industry of, okay, they're professional, qualified, experienced, trained, very few. So as you can imagine, with so many people requiring language support, whether it's in talking with government agencies, healthcare, and the list goes on, there was a real shortage of professional services. So so being able to respond to this almost new community language in terms of numbers and and size of it was clear. There was a real big problem. And actually, in terms of supporting those people, that became a problem.
So what happened?
Well, what happens is that people rely on Google Translate, the apps, family, friends, people who speak both the languages but aren't under that label professional translator interpreter. They do other jobs. They might be lawyers, they might be doctors, they might be but they have both of those languages.
Yeah, it's probably an heritage language for them. What happened here? Water is needed on both sides.
So that's exactly what happens. And we've I've seen it in the charity sector that actually I've seen charities basically advertising for volunteers with the languages that they need to help. Sometimes even jobs, to come and help support those language barriers. So it's that, and I think that's what I call, in terms of community languages, that's what I call the professional problem. Because in the UK, and I'm always just talking about the UK, just to make that very, very clear all the time, just think UK, that master's degrees in translation and interpreting, traditionally it's been French, Italian, Spanish, German. More recently, great to see, yes, programs now available in Arabic and Polish. But I would love to hear if anybody's watching this and knows of a MA in translation or interpreting in the UK in Farsi, in Urdu, you know, Bengali, let me know, because I've not seen one, you know. So you know, there are, and that, in a sense, that's what I call the professional problem when it comes to community languages, is that there are lots of professional translators and interpreters, loads. But there are fewer by crazy number of those who are qualified or trained or seen as, you know, in terms of the standards of the profession in the UK, that have those community languages. Romanian,
yes, that makes
Lithuanian,
sense.
you know, so that's a huge, you know, that's a huge problem in terms of language rights. It's a huge problem in terms of supporting people with language barriers if you go on that basis that you have to have a professional,
right?
You know. So and you know, we were talking earlier about thinking of the individual in their community, in their space. Now, if you're imagine you're in a town, a random town, not London, not Manchester, not Bristol, you know, imagine you're in Paynton, which is it's a small, you know, a much smaller town,
right?
You know, that, you know, but imagine that you're there and you need language support,
right?
You know. I mean, we're very lucky these days that there's telephone interpreting.
Yeah.
You know, so if you're in a you know, a hospital, or you go to your local GP and you need you
I
know,
learned
and
that from you last time, and I used it in a presentation. I
yeah,
used
your
this
local
example.
your local doctor, exactly.
Exactly.
And you need language support, then there are options there to use telephone interpreting. You know, in terms, especially in those, what, let's say, call them more high risk environments, hospitals, you know, legal system, etc. There are possibilities of getting a telephone interpreter. You're less likely in those remote, let's say, not so urban areas to
Right.
find somebody who can actually come, for one. And also, if we're talking about community languages that are maybe not as well resourced in a professional, let's say by professional standards,
Right.
then what happens if, though, you know, the smaller number of people who can respond to those help with those community languages, and they're telephone interpreting across the country? What happens if a number of people needing that language all need it at the same time?
Right.
Do you see what I mean? There's, you know, and that's what I mean about the professional
Like I
problem.
say, it's like things we don't usually think about, because in
Yeah.
the industry we tend to think about those mass languages, where that's why everybody, when they're doing their training in translation, usually, like you say, they tend to go to very specific language pairs, and most of us are still there and will always still there. And I think that if you ask someone in most countries in Europe if they want to study translation, what is their source language, they will say English, right? So I guess it's a pretty common thing to do. But I don't think we can go any further in this conversation without talking a little bit more about you, because you've done it a lot. You've talked about the fact that you're not a, let's call it, language professional by those standards.
Well, that's interesting, actually, because I do have an MA in translation.
Well, then.
So yeah, so actually, I do meet, let's say, very much meet the standards of being a
You're just not a
professional,
professional
but
translator
but
as such.
I do not work, as in I do not work in the industry. I do not earn my salary from being a translator
Right.
or interpreter.
But I just find it funny because you know so much about it, probably a lot more than a lot of the people who work professionally in the industry, and you don't consider yourself a professional by certain standards, let's say that, at least not a professional translator, which is totally fine, because in my books, being a professional translator doesn't make you a language professional, right? Because language professionals come in all shapes and sizes. And this is why I call the podcast the language worker, specifically because anybody who works in languages, not necessarily in the language business, but I usually focus on that because that's more common in my world. But this is why I thought it was so interesting to bring you in for this other fresh perspective on not working in this as such. But basically all the work that you do, let's face it, is about languages anyway.
Absolutely.
Because even your PhD research, can we know a little bit about that too?
Well, the research came about entirely because of working in languages for so long.
Yeah.
I found it, and actually that's, as I was just saying about all these almost contradictions or, catch-22s when it comes to languages, that I was just seeing all of this challenge, but also such a lot of opportunity, you know. There's a huge amount of opportunity to be able to share that knowledge with people so that they can respond in a more mindful way towards community languages and really, there's a lot of opportunity there. But yes, there's a lot of challenge. There's a lot of contradiction.
So this is why you
And
didn't become a translator, because was this your intention at some point, or what happened?
no, I actually never intended to become a freelance translator.
Mhm.
I I got my MA purely because of volunteering.
Okay.
And understanding the complexities of it. And also,
Yeah.
I'm very much the type of person that if I want to do something, I want to learn. I want to learn. I want to, educate myself essentially
So when you
about
first
what
went to university, what did you study?
international relations and
Mm,
politics. Yeah.
okay. Just like my
So
brother, exactly the same.
so that was the, and my own experiences throughout my whole life as well, I suppose, brings me much closer to community languages rather than the profession. So being bilingual, having, family members um, who don't speak English. So as a child, I did child language brokering to a very small extent, but as I went through my career as well, I was continuously confronted with um, opportunities. That might be a nicer way of putting it, to translate and
Hmm.
interpret because I was bilingual. So essentially, I was trained in translation and interpreting almost through like a baptism of fire. Because let's be honest, the translation industry and profession is quite a new one in terms of the standards and etc. Language translation and interpreting has been happening for centuries without
Yes,
an MA.
of course.
It's only been in the last 50 years that it's professionalized,
Yes.
let's say.
Hmm.
Um, so yes, there is still a lot of let un just a lack of, let's say, a lack of awareness
Hmm.
in many industries or business sectors where they still, there is a belief that um that translation or interpreting is almost a natural thing. And in a
Hmm.
sense, and actually, don't get me wrong, because there are many, going back to these different areas and spheres of work of where languages happen, there are
Hmm.
many of those areas that do not need an MA in translation or
Hmm.
interpreting. It really doesn't. The business world, I would say, absolutely does need
Yeah.
people who are trained, experienced, etc., because they're looking for a certain level of you know of 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 real perfection,
Mm.
shall we say. They're looking, the business world is looking for highly polished translation
And like you said,
and
with a very
interpreting.
specific
you
purpose that
know
is not to look at one individual, but to look at
yeah,
the masses.
and also to look at where the communication is happening.
Yeah.
So I'll be honest, throughout the 10 years I've been working in the charity sector with languages, I've come across a lot of disparaging reactions. Oh, you can't do that. That's not right. You need professionals to do that. And it's like, well, actually, we can see when we do the screening and when we understand the circumstances whether professional support is needed or not. And I think, and that's why I said at the beginning that, I never engage with a charity in a kind of dictating or almost autocratic way that says you have to get a highly qualified, experienced interpreter or translator to do that. It's just not it's not even feasible at times, as we talked about the cost question, the lack of professional people with those language, there's all many challenges, but on a very, in a way, on a very basic level, it depends on the circumstances.
Yeah.
So I'll give you a clear example of a charity in response to the Ukrainian influx. Wanted to set up a volunteer service of language volunteers. And the reaction was, oh, no, you got to have professionals to do that, And I could almost see, the kind of almost adversarial kind of straight away. And this charity was kind of said, oh, well, don't worry, it won't be anything critical. It's not anything, you could almost see them saying, no, don't worry, it's not about, it's not life-threatening situation here, because what they're talking about is helping a Ukrainian woman with a 2-year-old child go to a play group.
Okay. Because this is how we look at it. We're so used to looking at it from a certain perspective.
And I think that's why I'm always very conscious never to bring my professional knowledge or my professional maybe bias to the situation, because I don't know their situation. In terms of, I don't know their financials. Well, I tend to understand, because actually when it comes to screening charities, we have a look at what they do, how they do it, how they're financed, because in order to support a charity through Charity Translators, we have to almost make sure that we're supporting the right people, and we're not inadvertently doing translation work for a company. Do you see what I mean? So that, we have to screen the charity. We also have to screen the project. We have to check the project. We have to see, is it suitable for volunteers, or actually is somebody who's professional required? But that's a grey area as well. Because actually, yes, there are benchmarks of what makes a professional, but that's not regulated. So I think it's becoming better now, depending on whether a translation agency is with an association that requires benchmarks in terms of professional qualifications and experience. But there are also plenty of translation agencies out there who may not be registered with a body, an association.
In being ISO certified, right?
Exactly. And in those situations, how does the charity, keep it in the charity thing, they're going to, let's say, pay for an interpreter or for some translation. But then that charity isn't aware that actually there are plenty of companies out there that don't necessarily, that aren't ISO certified, and actually those translators and interpreters may not have that high level of qualifications and experience that meets what they need. Do you see what I mean? So
I didn't know it played such an important part in your specific experience, that people were more or less qualified, or what the story was.
Well, it's so varied, isn't there? You can have somebody who's qualified, who's got an MA in translation, who maybe has 2 years of experience, but that's a very different offering to somebody who's, let's say, has 10 or 15 years of experience, and in terms of meeting what the charity might need. You know, it's like I say, it's almost like how long is a piece of string with any
So
of
how
these
do you
things.
yourself do it? Do you go by your feeling, by your,
In what sense?
like when you have to imagine that you have people to choose from? I don't know if that's the case, volunteers to choose from for a certain project, but I suppose you do, depending on the language pair.
Hmm.
So how do you go about that? Do you go by your gut feeling, or you also evaluate their CV, or how does that go?
Absolutely.
You do.
Yes, yeah. That's exactly how we do it. We evaluate yes, we have to see what kind of
Mhm.
experience somebody has, and then decide
So
whether
you
they
cannot
have
say, "Hey, Cari, here I am, and I know how to speak Farsi and English, and take me. I can
yeah. Oh, we have a
translate
very
about your garden."
we have an open door policy, absolutely open door policy to everybody who wants to support
Hmm.
languages in the community. How we do that is, it's almost one of my mantras is I don't care who does it, but it does matter how it's done,
Right.
you know? And that's why when it comes to translation projects, first of all, we make sure that it's suitable for volunteers. Then the first phase will be, whoever's come back and joined the project will do the translation phase. And the review phase, people assigned to that review phase will always have been seen as having more experience in the
Hmm.
translation. And it's collaborative, so it's very different to what has traditionally been in the profession as the kind of lone wolf attitude where you get a translation, you do the translation, you self-review, you send it back to the client. I know
Right.
that's changed in recent years where there is a much more, let's say, review aspect.
Hmm.
But there's still very little collaboration,
Hmm.
where people can talk to each other,
Yeah,
or you can
that's
go
right.
back, it's still more translation, review,
Hmm.
and in a way that's kind of how we approach it.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, yeah.
So this means that you have some sort of an agency, really. It's just not a commercial
Ouch, that's a
agency.
terrible word.
I know. Even in the industry, people, you have to call it a company if it's a certain way,
Mm.
you have to call it an
No,
agency
we're
if it's
definitely a
another way.
network. We're definitely a network. That's how we've always operated.
Yeah, but you
That's
do
how we
take
work.
little bits of information from here and there and make whatever you need
Mm.
to to get your goal of helping people in their very specific
Yeah, and
situation.
like I say, we try and share information as much as possible. So if and also, what I think is also really important is just understanding where they're coming from,
Hmm.
you know, and that's it's almost vitally important to understand where they're coming from, what they're as a charity,
Right.
um, you know, what they're trying to achieve. I mean, at the end of the day, they don't have to support languages at all,
Right.
they really don't have to. So the fact that they're trying
Mm.
is already something quite amazing,
Yeah.
you know. Um, and then, yeah, just being mindful and having some empathy with their situation that actually, they're trying. Um, in an ideal world, if somebody said to me in a dream world, how
Mm.
would you support in a dream, how would you support community
Right.
languages? And in a dream world, I would say there would be a big pot of money.
Because you think that would make everything very different.
There would be a big pot of money whereby that could be allocated to charities to support languages and to help the people they're trying to help. Because essentially, Charity Translators is about helping the people. We
Hmm.
do that through charities because that's the way we can do it. We're not,
Right.
in a way, we're not really there to help charities. We're there to help the people who need
People.
the
Hmm.
language support,
Yeah.
so we kind of do it in a bit of a
Mm. It's just to
um
organize things, right? So
it
it's,
it makes sense. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely makes sense. So I think that's the important thing is understanding their circumstances, their situation, knowing
Mm.
what is possible. But I would definitely never say to someone, "Oh no, you can't use volunteers. You can't do this, you can't do that. You have
Right.
to you have to do a fundraising event in order to be able to pay for an
Hmm.
interpreter." But then I also have to explain to them how, if they are going to pay for an interpreter, what they need to know.
Mm-hmm.
They need to ask about the qualifications. They need to ask about what experience. They need to ask about, have they worked in their specific area of work before? They need to know about briefing a translator, a volunteer translator or interpreter. What what information do they need to provide? So there's all kinds of facets to it, and it is very bespoke. That's the thing. Every single charity is different. Every single project or need is different, and you have to meet them. But yes, I do wish there was a big pot of money that you could just go, oh, this charity needs an interpreter. Great, there you go. Get a professional, but check this, because it's not just about saying, oh, I'll get a professional. It's about making sure that professional meets what they need. So there's some interesting research that I read not so long ago that actually suggested that highly qualified, experienced conference interpreters didn't do well in a charity situation because they were so highly professionalized and structured and that they weren't able to adapt to that more community person-centered interaction. So it, like I say, it's fascinating area of work.
Like I say, you have
and
that's
why I'm doing the research.
You have to bring a lot of your knowledge to the table constantly, because I think people need to know. And I think it's like it can help each other, like your needs in very specific setting and the commercial needs and all of that. One can benefit from the other's knowledge.
Yeah. And I think another common misconception is that volunteers have no experience at all. While Charity Translators completely disproves that. There's a huge number of volunteers who what we would class as on that benchmark of professional and experienced.
Yes, I thought about that, because I see a lot of people who work with other institutions or whatever in those settings, and they seem to me that they're people who have been in the business for many years, and they just find that they can contribute in a certain way. So
absolutely,
I thought it was already established, right? Because it's like a lot of people just they feel like they can bring something to the table, and they just
which is wonderful. And I think I think that's definitely an area that people inside the translation industry can definitely add value by contributing to charity work.
Right.
Particularly those that have no money, should I say.
Yes, no, because with you we realize that money isn't always the issue, right? Because obviously you can do your thing without having funding somehow, and you manage, and people are interested in your projects and they're keen to participate. And as we can see in this community, there are also a lot of people who are interested in helping just for the sake of helping, because it's a people to people kind of thing. So
I can't tell
amazing.
you, the difference that volunteers at Charity Translators have made, the impact they have had on people in communities, on supporting charities to actually be more diverse, actually has just been immense. And I really can never thank them enough, because it's actually the volunteers that really make it happen. And it's the volunteers that really make the difference, which is, it's amazing, really amazing.
Yeah, I guess we should find some time to talk to some of them one of these days. So
that's a great idea.
Yeah, I think we should do that. Cari, thank you so much. I will
my pleasure.
Refrain from pronouncing your last name for now, and maybe in a conversation in the future I'll try to do it. Is it Bottois?
Très bien. C'est très bien. C'est parfait.
I'll practice. Thank you so much for this. This was a different conversation, and I think you brought a lot to the table. Your knowledge is unbelievable. And I'm sure that the community that already is here for you will keep on being here for you. And maybe we have more people interested, not that they'll listen to us and see how amazing you are and how knowledgeable you are,
Oh,
because
thank
you
you.
are a real language worker. So thank you so much.
Can
Yes,
I just say one
of
last
course you
thing?
can.
Obviously, this chat about community languages was really to highlight language rights.
Mm-hmm.
And as we said at the beginning, Global Language Advocacy Day,
Mm-hmm.
22nd of February. There are lots of initiatives, events, talks, blogs, all around language rights and what that means and how to support it. So I would really encourage everybody to take a look at the program. They have a page on LinkedIn, and I'll be involved with it as well. So yeah, please get involved.
If you're going to be involved, I'm sure that most of us will see it and think about it. So I will have a different approach on all of these things from now on. So thank you so much. I
Thank you,
really
Rita.
appreciate it. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.